Deep night enveloped the world in a quiet coolness. The bright moon shone majestically in the sky, illuminating everything around with a soft silver light. The deck of the ship offered a mesmerizing view of the sparkling iridescent water, as if strewn with jewels. The lady's fair hair flowed in the wind, resembling a golden wave. The girl took a deep breath, looking into the distance. She folded her graceful arms across her chest and raised her eyebrows with an expression of quiet melancholy. Eliza gently ran her hand over her small belly, lost in her thoughts. She was thinking about returning, but the exact date remained a mystery to her. The blonde believed that she would soon have to return, at least for a short time. Warm and bright memories of the past gradually arose in her thoughts. Remembering her first kiss, she couldn't help but feel a slight blush appear on her cheeks. That moment, full of timid tenderness and excitement, again vividly echoed in her heart. The girl realized with sadness that she and Richard had only been together for a year. She could not understand why his image remained so vivid in her memory, as if much more time had passed. Eliza opened her palm, looking again at the bright red brooch. It was decorated with exquisite golden plants, coiling around it, giving the decoration elegance and warmth. The blonde clutched the jewelry tightly and pursed her lips sadly. Her eyes reflected sadness, and she squeezed it a little tighter, as if trying to hold on to something important. Suddenly, the girl felt a strong gust of wind. It scattered her long, curled hair, causing it to fly in the air as if alive. The sudden change in the weather puzzled the girl, and she looked up at the sky. Trying to understand what had caused this strange turn of events, a small hope appeared in her heart. What she saw shocked Eliza. Her bright sea-green eyes widened, not believing what she saw. A familiar image appeared before the girl, hovering in the air, which she could not confuse with anything else. It was the same, the only Richard. The man looked angrily at his escaped lover, pursing his lips. His scarlet eyes radiated rage, making the situation even more tense. Eliza looked at Richard worriedly, not knowing what to do. Suddenly, she remembered his words about finding her wherever she was. The girl did not understand why she remembered his words now. She wondered where she should run, but soon realized that there was no place left to hide. The man began to land on the side of the ship, and the blonde excitedly pressed her hands to her chest. She thought about how she had no chance to escape from the one who commanded the wind. Richard stepped forward, his feet touching the surface lightly, each step making a soft thud that broke the light breeze. Frowning, the brunette asked if the girl really thought she could run away and he wouldn't find her. His gaze was stern. Eliza stood like a statue, unable to utter a word. Her whole body was seized with momentary confusion, and she could not move from the spot. Suddenly, the man wrapped his arm around her waist, pulled her towards him, and holding her head, leaned in, preparing to kiss her. His movements were quick but gentle, as if waiting for her reaction. Then he asked where the girl was going with their child. Eliza froze, not knowing what to answer. Her thoughts were confused, and her gaze was filled with uncertainty. In the center of the city stood a white manor with a bright red roof. Smooth, straight walls gave the building austerity, and high windows added grandeur and light. A lady-in-waiting with long hair tied into a neat bun entered the room. Bowing, she turned to Milady, informing her that the Duke wished to see her. The girl smiled and said with confidence that she already knew about it. She was wearing a luxurious blue dress and a sparkling hair clip. Her look radiated confidence and her behavior was mischievous. The heroine was called Eliza Rublin. It so happened that she was reborn as the heroine of the novel, but she had already come to terms with it. Milady followed the maid quietly down the long corridor. However, one thing continued to upset the girl. She did not understand why she was reborn in a 19-plus novel. The heroine's real name is Soyuna. In her past life, at the age of 20, she immersed herself in the worlds of fantasy novels every day, enjoying their exciting stories. Be that as it may, one day her life all came to an abrupt end. Due to her carelessness, a fatal car accident occurred. Living out her final moments, Soyuna realized that everything had come to an end. Accepting her fate, she quietly closed her eyes. After a while, opening her eyes, the girl felt warmth and dryness around her. Looking around, she realized that she was now in someone else's body. Soyuna, now Eliza, found herself in a luxurious bed in soft pink tones. Soft fabric surrounded her, and her long blonde hair fell freely onto the silky bedspread. In the first days, the girl was overcome with confusion and fear. Gradually, thinking about what had happened, she began to understand what exactly had happened to her. Seo Yuna was reborn as the heroine of the novel Golden Cage, a category 19+. Knowing the plot down to the smallest detail, she realized that in the future, she would have to become the mother of the villain of this novel. In the book, Eliza grew up in the family of an earl, although she was an orphan by birth. The lack of love created in her a strong dependence on others, which made her relationship with Richard extremely toxic. Having not experienced parental love in childhood, the heroine is unhappy in adulthood. In the finale of the novel, her tragic fate ends with her death at the hands of her own husband. Eliza clutched the hem of her silk dress sullenly, determined not to let her life end so sadly. The girls stopped in front of the huge door. The maid warned them that she was going to enter the room with my lady. According to the book's plot, Eliza was supposed to live another 10 full years. Firmly pursing her lips, the girl decided that during this time she simply had to change her fate. Albert Roblin was in the office. He was dressed in an exquisite suit made of expensive fabric. His neatly trimmed beard gave the image a special solidity and elegance. The man was the most influential person in the empire. He was the head of the famous Roblin family, nicknamed the Storm. Only a year had passed since the Duke had lost his wife and son, consumed by grief. This short period of suffering had left an indelible mark on his heart. The man patiently opened his cigarette case, took one out and carefully lit it. A thin stream of smoke soon rose into the air, reflecting his calm and thoughtfulness. Taking a deep breath, Albert Roblin exhaled the smoke and calmly announced that it was time for Eliza to get married. There was a hint of malevolence in his voice. The Duke noted that a commoner like her should be grateful, since she had the honor of becoming part of his great family. The girl frowned in displeasure, deciding to remain silent. However, Milady understood everything. The only ducal family of the empire would not marry their son to a girl from an impoverished family. She lived in the slums, and besides, she was an orphan. Eliza's biological father, Count Lohengrin, died 3 years ago. All that was left behind were memories and a daughter who still could not forget that bitter loss. The Count's wife died in a road accident. Only Eliza managed to survive thanks to a lucky coincidence. Unfortunately, the girl did not inherit her father's fortune because his business went bankrupt. She had no more relatives left, and she was left all alone in this huge world. Despite all this, the Duke decided to choose her, among dozens of young noblewomen. It seemed as if he needed her for some reason. The man blew out another stream of acrid smoke. He said with displeasure that women had it too easy. Albert explained that all that was needed was for the man to bear an heir. After that, any girl could enjoy a luxurious life at his expense. Eliza's face reflected complete calm, but inside everything was boiling. She had only just started her period, and the Duke was already telling her about the birth. She found his words extremely disgusting. The girl categorically disagreed with Albert. On the contrary, men always had it easy. They could chat carefree while smoking a cigarette, thereby strengthening their connections and increasing their authority. The head of the family always had enough to go somewhere, do something or talk to someone, and then return home. When something was presented to him at home, he simply shouted and snapped. Men often took all the credit for their female companions' efforts in creating a family, which often devalued their efforts and made women feel useless. Suddenly, there was a sharp knock on the door which broke the silence. A moment later, it opened slightly, and a couple of men entered the office. A brown-haired man with a sparse mustache reported that the young Duke was delayed by a clash with bandits. A fair-haired priest stood behind him, quietly watching what was happening. Taking a deep breath, Albert Roblin calmly put out his cigarette. In a condescending tone, he stated that there were no robbers on his roads. In an awkward tone, the interlocutor explained that these were the words of the young Duke. He added that the guest would soon arrive, having crossed the mountain pass. The man asked why it was necessary to create such difficulties. The brown-haired man handed over the document and explained that the young man considered this route safer. Albert called the young Duke a foolish man who was creating unnecessary problems. Knowing that the guest would not arrive until midnight, the man realized that this was his way of expressing his attitude towards the engagement. The Duke pointed to a place on the document and asked Eliza to sign it. She looked at the paper with displeasure and frowned, realizing that it was a marriage contract. Milady waited 10 long years before this marriage ended in murder. She thought that she could have not given birth to her husband's child and done everything to not even fall in love with him. The girl grabbed the pen abruptly, casually dipping it into the ink. She began to sign, paying almost no attention to the smoothness of the lines, only hurrying to finish. Eliza dreamed of the luxurious life of a duchess, anticipating wealth and status. She thought that in the event of a divorce, she would be able to sue her husband for a significant portion of his fortune. The priest watched every movement of Milady's hand closely. His gaze was intense, as if trying to guess the little girl's hidden intentions. As soon as Eliza finished, the man sat up straight, clasping his hands together. Then he bowed his head and began to recite the prayer, his voice loud and confident. Finally, the priest solemnly declared that Richard Rublin and Eliza Leon Green had become husband and wife. He emphasized that their union was blessed by the goddess Irina. The girl suddenly had a strange, inexplicable feeling. Her thoughts became alarmingly clear, and she realized that in 8 years something would definitely happen in this place. Leaving Duke Rublin's office, the lady-in-waiting politely asked Milady to follow her. A few minutes later, she escorted the young duchess to her new chambers, filled with grandeur. As soon as the doors swung open, Eliza's face lit up with surprise and admiration. Examining every corner, her gaze slid for a long time around the shining room with its luxurious interior. Eliza had been living in her new quarters for 10 days since settling in. Sliding into the future, she wondered if the Duchess's bedroom would be as luxurious when she got married. Milady's wardrobe was filled with many exquisite outfits. Every day, admiring the clean and ironed dresses, she enjoyed their impeccable beauty. At the end of each day, the girl sank into her soft bed with pleasure. She was informed that Richard Rublin was to arrive today, and her thoughts were filled with anticipation again. It was getting on for midnight and still very quiet outside. Eliza decided that perhaps he hadn't arrived yet and decided that was just as well. The girl was overcome with mixed feelings. On the one hand, she was intrigued by the arrival of her husband, but on the other, she was overcome with fear of what awaited her ahead. According to the plot, Richard was supposed to have died several years before the novel began. That is why Eliza knew very little about him. However, there was one scene that left a deep mark on the girl's memory. It spoke far from flatteringly about his character, leaving an unpleasant impression. Looking at the front doors, Milady begged the boy not to come today. After a while, her mind began to calm down, falling into a calm, foggy sleep. Eliza's expressive eyes closed. Having let go of all her disturbing thoughts, she fell asleep quite quickly. Suddenly, the large arched window swung open with a slight creak. A cool wind rushed into the room and gently woke the sleeping girl. Eliza sat up discontentedly, trying to drive away the remnants of sleep. Rubbing her eyes, she asked in a sleepy voice who dared to disturb her peace at such a late hour. The broad-shouldered guy's silhouette was clearly outlined against the moonlight. His dark hair swayed slightly in the wind, and his slightly disheveled shirt emphasized his confident figure. The girl froze, unable to move, her body as if petrified with fear. Cold sweat appeared on her pale face, slowly running down her cheeks. Eliza still couldn't figure out who this guy was. Suddenly, the stranger reached out to her, and she couldn't help but scream in fear. The girl sat with her eyes closed, trembling with fear like a statue. Every second dragged on endlessly, and she mentally begged the stranger to stay away. The guy carefully pulled the curtain aside, lightly touching it with his hand. The rustle of the fabric made Eliza shudder and shrink, as if she was expecting something frightening. Richard clicked his tongue in displeasure at the sight of the little girl, who was overcome with fear. He frowned in annoyance, unable to believe that she was so young. The guy looked at Eliza condescendingly for a while, clearly displeased. She trembled silently, unable to find words and afraid to move. Finally, the young duke turned and walked resolutely towards the door, his long hair softly swaying as if obeying his every movement. The brunette confidently grabbed the door handle but suddenly froze. The door was locked, and this caused him obvious bewilderment. The confusion on the guy's face quickly turned to rage. He began to pound on the door with force, gritting his teeth, cursing viciously under his breath. Milady looked at the brunette carefully, and suddenly a realization struck her. In front of her stood Richard, her husband, whom she saw for the first time. The girl suddenly felt a sharp gust of wind that had made its way into the room. Goosebumps instantly ran across her skin, leaving behind a slight chill. Eliza looked around in confusion, trying to understand what was happening. The confusion grew because the window remained tightly closed. After a moment, Milady realized that this was probably the Rublins' magic. Her gaze became calm, although the inner unrest did not disappear. It was rumored that magic was passed down from time to time in their family. They had mastered wind magic. According to the novel's plot, Richard and his son Haynes were both endowed with such a unique power. Their magic was so powerful that they became true guardians of the wind. Eliza pressed her lips together tensely as she watched her husband's rage on. It seemed as if he was about to break down and knock down the huge doors. The young Duke continued to grow more and more angry, his voice growing louder and his words becoming harsher. He cursed more and more loudly with each blow on the door, expressing his fury. Suddenly Richard turned to his wife, his gaze burning with fire. She involuntarily shuddered, deciding that he was going to approach her. The girl reacted instantly, hiding under the blanket as if in a shelter. The guy, casting a glance at her, only sighed heavily and restrainedly. Hearing loud and confident steps, Eliza closed her eyes in fear, expecting the worst. Her fragile hands trembled, involuntarily clenching into strong fists. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped, which surprised Milady greatly. She froze for a moment and carefully opened her eyes. The girl looked out from under the blanket with curiosity, trying to understand what had happened. Eliza felt her excitement leave her completely. Seeing that her husband had settled down on a small sofa, she wondered if she, as a wife, should say something to him. Milady greeted the young Duke awkwardly. Clearing her throat, she introduced herself as Eliza Lohan Green. The girl quietly added that from today on she would become Eliza Rublina. However, Richard did not react in any way, continuing to lie there with a displeased look. After a short pause, Milady turned to his lordship even more respectfully, waiting for an answer. He only snorted in displeasure, as if she should not have tried so hard. Her husband's reaction almost drove Eliza crazy. She hadn't yet figured out his character, but she already guessed that he was, first and foremost, a rude person. It was night outside, but the moonlight illuminated everything brightly. Despite this, the streets remained empty and silent, as if time had stopped. As soon as it was light, the young Duke immediately went to Albert Roblin's office. His brows were furrowed and his scarlet eyes were burning with anger, as if a real fire was burning inside. Noticing his son's fierce gaze, the man immediately assumed a serious expression. Lighting a cigarette, he prepared to withstand any storm of words. In an irritated tone, the boy ordered the Duke to immediately cancel the engagement. Clenching his fists until the knuckles turned white, he tried to contain his anger. Taking the cigarette out of his mouth, Albert let out a light laugh. He confidently declared that marriage vows made before the goddess were forbidden to be broken. Richard replied sullenly that he had made no vows. The man merely smiled in bewilderment and calmly asked if he really wanted to break his promise. Without waiting for an answer, Albert Rublin calmly asked what exactly the young Duke did not like about his wife. Raising his head, he replied that the girl was too young, although very beautiful. The Duke asked if the boy really wanted to imitate him and choose as a wife only the one he truly loved. He remained silent, clenching his fists even tighter. Tapping his fingers on the table, the man said that the newlyweds would live together until they grew up. Then he added that it was time for them to think about heirs. The conversation grew tense, and the Duke added that when Eliza gave birth to a child, the boy could marry anyone he wanted. However, these words were the last straw, causing Richard to lose his temper. A wind filled with anger began to rage in the room. Unable to bear it, the young Duke shouted sharply that this was not the case at all. Silently putting out his cigarette, Albert Rublin slowly rose from his desk. The scattered sheets of paper continued to circle around the office like birds. The man stated firmly that Richard was his only heir. It was his direct duty to accept his wife and conceive a child with her, and refusal to do so was unacceptable. The Duke added that the boy had everything he could wish for in life. All this only because he was his heir. In a terrifying voice, Albert declared that if Richard continued to persist, everything would be taken from him. His wolfish eyes blazed with fury, as if ready to swallow anyone. However, the boy was not afraid of the Duke. He calmly said that no one asked his opinion whether he wanted to be his heir or not. Heading towards the exit, the young Duke loudly declared that he had no feelings for the girl. He ordered that she not be allowed into his room again. Richard suddenly bumped into Eliza, who had just entered the room. Their eyes met, and for a moment they both stood in surprise. The guy, lowering his frowning gaze, silently walked around his wife, intending to leave the room. She only sighed sadly and, smiling slightly, greeted His Excellency the Duke. Albert Rublin slowly stubbed out his smoking cigarette, looking away. Then he turned to Richard and calmly told him to wait a bit. The man said that he knew about the young Duke's absence from the first breakfast after the marriage. The newlyweds' faces showed surprise, and the brunette turned around, looking questioningly at his father. Eliza was aware of the tradition of a family celebratory breakfast after the wedding night. The maid immediately shared this information with her. The girl was suddenly overcome by a wave of sadness. Early in the morning, she woke up alone in the room. Having put herself in order, Eliza realized that the Duke had not come to the refectory either. Albert Roblin laughed and noted that the newlyweds seemed to have looked at each other properly for the first time. After that, he confidently declared that they would certainly find a common language. The man advised the couple to get closer gradually, emphasizing that no one was rushing them, at least not yet. However, his words caused the guys to be slightly perplexed, and they frowned. Richard snorted in irritation, making it clear that he stood by his opinion. He firmly stated that he would not allow the girl to continue living in his room. The Duke reminded him again that husband and wife usually shared a bed. He asked what kind of problem the guy had with that, but he just turned away. Richard walked out of the office with loud steps and slammed the door. This caused his wife's hair to fly up and she drooped, closing her eyes. After seeing off the wild air with his eyes, Albert Roblin turned to Eliza with pride, saying that she had come at the right time. He explained that he wanted to give her something. The servant handed Milady an exquisite book, which she began to examine with surprise. The man added that a teacher would come tomorrow who would work with the girl using this manual. From the title of the textbook, Eliza realized that it was about housekeeping. The Duke advised her to study hard, assuring her that someday she would become the head of the family. Clutching the book to her chest, Milady bowed before his lordship. She realized that she would have to learn stuffy and old-fashioned traditions. As she left the office, Eliza leaned wearily against the door, letting out a long groan. Her eyes remained closed, as if she was trying to escape reality. The girl grabbed the book roughly and frowned in displeasure. She couldn't believe that she would have to memorize Demostroy, as if she didn't have other things to do. Night had fallen, illuminated only by the bright crescent moon. In the amazing manner, all the windows continued to glow, creating a sense of life in every room. Eliza had completely tidied herself up, and it was time to return to her room. She tried to persuade the maids to leave her in another room, but to no avail. Opening the heavy door slightly, Milady looked around, hoping that Richard was not there. Deep down, she felt relieved that he might be somewhere else. Almost immediately, the girl noticed the man's legs. With a little disappointment, she realized that her husband was lying on the sofa. Suddenly, Milady remembered today's conversation between father and son. It seemed strange and completely inadequate to her. Everyone knew that the thunderstorm of Rublins perceived Richard only as a continuer of the family line. Feeling like a breeding stallion, the guy invariably lost his temper because of this. A rather interesting thought came to Eliza's mind, and she smiled. Now she understood that the enemy of her enemy could become a reliable ally. The young husband lay on the sofa, pretending not to notice Milady. Despite this, stubbornness was visible on his face. The girl addressed Richard in a kind and gentle tone. She assumed that he had not heard her yesterday, so she decided to introduce herself again. Without letting his wife finish, the young Duke suddenly interrupted her, asking for something important. She fell silent in surprise, asking what he wanted, and he rudely asked her to leave. Eliza felt rage spreading inside her after hearing this. Her body tensed and her gaze became puzzled. She understood that the guy was clearly not in a good mood. The girl tried her best to contain her anger, taking a deep breath and closing her eyes for a moment. Then, swallowing her resentment, she bid her husband goodnight with a gentle smile. Turning around, Milady pouted, finding Richard too stubborn. She couldn't understand why he had such a hard time returning her greeting in a human way. Without moving, the boy slightly opened one eye, looking at Eliza with interest. His gaze was full of curiosity, and he looked at her from her back, from head to toe. The next day, Eliza Rublina's training began. Her training began with exercises for posture and even head posture. She walked diligently to the count, balancing a book on her head. Milady devoted her time to learning the art of embroidery, refined manners, and the finer points of etiquette. These knowledge and skills were considered essential for a young duchess. The girl also practiced writing, carefully drawing each letter. She had to be patient and persistent because such activities seemed unbearably boring to her. However, this schedule had its advantages. After finishing her lessons, Eliza had complete freedom for the rest of the day. She happily devoted these hours to reading her favorite books. Milady was pleased that the Duke's library was incredibly huge. It offered the widest selection of books. The girl didn't know this world at all, so the library became a real treasure for her. She devoted most of her time to reading, discovering new and exciting things. Eliza had been happy with many things in her life lately, except for one thing. She was furious at Richard's condescending attitude toward her. The couple should have worked together on a divorce plan, but the guy categorically refused to cooperate. This made the girl very irritated. With an indignant look, the wife once again approached Richard before bedtime. Having tried to start a conversation, he again answered that she should just go to bed. Standing next to the sofa, the girl took a deep breath, collecting her thoughts. She tried to calm down, but emotions continued to boil inside. Richard was about to send her back to bed, but she interrupted him. His wife suggested that they go to bed together, assuring him that she had no intention of eating him. Having calmed down, Eliza smiled broadly and happily. Her eyes shone with warmth and calm. She asked him to take her hand and go to bed together. Unwittingly letting out a laugh, the husband's face instantly distorted. He was shocked that the girl was actually serious about it. Suddenly, Richard remembered how that same day in the library he had tiredly fallen onto the table. Seeing her husband, Milady quietly approached him and decided to cover him with a blanket. The guy grabbed the girl's hand abruptly, making her freeze. His eyes were full of bewilderment, but he didn't want her to notice his weakness. The frightened Milady began to explain that she had brought the blanket because she thought Richard had fallen asleep. There was excitement in her voice. After Eliza's words, the guy finally let go of her wrist. Calling him a savage, she rubbed the sore spot in frustration, not hiding her emotions. The young duke suddenly grinned as he sat up. He chuckled and asked if it was Albert Rublin who had tried to get the girl to seduce him. Milady was full of bewilderment. Her look expressed great confusion, and she could not believe that her husband said this seriously. Eliza stated with certainty that she had not acted on the orders of His Grace the Duke. Richard snorted, clasped his hands together, and asked why he should believe her. The girl thought that her husband was simply at a nervous age. However, she could not help but notice how he always called his father a duke. This relationship was absolutely fragile and cold. Milady began by telling him that she was an orphan, having lost both her parents. She assumed that Richard already knew this, but decided to repeat her story anyway. Eliza continued that Albert Rublin was the only one who took custody of her. The boy nodded, taking a deep breath as if he was about to say something. Richard explained that lies about family were most easily exposed when someone was trying to mislead others. There was a note of menace in his voice. Milady's mouth dropped open, surprised by her husband's words. She assumed that he didn't trust anyone at all, having grown up surrounded by lies. Placing her hand on her chest, Eliza quietly said that she was only 12 years old. She tried to explain that she had a choice between life on the streets and marriage. As if not paying attention to her words, the guy deftly crossed one leg over the other. He looked at her questioningly and asked if the Duke had really taught her to seduce her husband in this way. The wife pursed her lips, trying to contain her raging emotions. She assumed that was the case, and then asked what difference it would make. Her words discouraged the guy. Eliza explained that even if she tried to seduce him, no one forced him to give in to it. He made his own decision, and her actions could not force him to do anything against his will. Richard looked at his wife, his gaze focused and serious. He did not answer but continued to silently watch her. Milady froze. Her gaze became thoughtful. She began to mentally return to the plot of that novel, trying to remember every detail. The Great Alencia clan was founded by the efforts of 4 distinguished families. The first of these were the Storm Rublins, masters of wind magic. Following them, the Flame Cairo took their place in the clan. These fire mages were famous for their power and skillful mastery of the flaming element. The penultimate to join the founders were the Esther Singers. These masters of earth magic were renowned for their harmony with nature and the art of manipulating stone and soil. The fourth and final family to complete the clan's formation were the life-giving Serios. These water mages were renowned for their ability to grant life and control the element of water. All these families stood at the origins of the empire. One day they gathered for a great council to determine which of them was destined to take the throne and become the first emperor. Of all the families, the Flame Cairo and the Storm Rublins were the most ambitious, each seeking to take the place of the imperial dynasty and establish their own power. The debate lasted for a long time, but in the end the great families came to a unified decision. The Flame Cairo were chosen to ascend the throne, sealing their right with the ancient eternal oath. At the core of the promise was the Cairo family's oath to care for and serve the people faithfully and truly. They vowed to never put their own interests above the welfare of the empire. The Rublins, in turn, have also taken on important responsibilities. They have vowed to act as a counterweight to the royal family, to maintain a balance of power. Over time, the oaths began to lose their power. The interests of the authorities increasingly came into conflict with the original ideals of caring for the people. The Cairo imperial family plotted to usurp the Rublins' power. Without thinking twice, they decided to do so by merging the families. The idea was to seize the power of the Wind Mages through the union of the crown princess and the young duke. They were both about the same age. To prevent such a development, Albert Rublin found Eliza among noble families. Without thinking twice, he proposed that she marry his son. Milady added that, of course, Richard could marry the crown princess. However, after that, he would have no girlfriend in his life, no one who would be on his side. The guy thoughtfully touched his chin. He was sure that his wife was completely empty-headed. However, the brunette soon realized that he was very wrong. Looking at the young duke, Eliza declared with determination that she did not need either a title or an heir. She spoke these words with sincerity, placing her hand on her heart. Eliza sincerely asked Richard to be patient and not to divorce her until she came of age. Then she promised to go to a place where he would never see her again. The guy stubbornly looked at his wife. Her gaze was just as persistent. They entered into a silent battle of glances where each tried to hold their positions. A few seconds later, the young duke agreed to Eliza's proposal, but on one condition. She had to leave within the specified time. Morning came. A light breeze from the windows gently touched the face of the young duke, involuntarily waking him up. Coming out of a deep sleep, the boy felt something warm touch his back. He smiled, thinking about the incredible warmth of the blanket. Suddenly, a realization hit Richard and he froze in surprise. His wife was asleep, holding him tightly around the chest, snoring softly. His mouth opened involuntarily and the hair on his body stood on end. The young duke suddenly came to his senses, flushing brightly. Even screaming as if a cat had touched water, he abruptly pulled away, trying to free himself from the gentle embrace. The guy indignantly asked what Eliza was doing, adding that she was sticking like a tick. He spread his arms out to the sides as if he was afraid to touch his wife. The husband, irritated, told her not to claim that she had rolled up to him by accident. Noticing the pillow at the other end of the bed, he realized that she had simply displaced him. As Richard was about to leave, he suddenly heard an anxious moaning sound. Looking back, he noticed his wife, shivering, beginning to mumble quietly, complaining that she was cold. The young duke pursed his lips, frowned, and his gaze darted around the room. Doubt and indecision fought inside him. He couldn't figure out what to do in this situation. After a minute of thought, Richard covered his wife with a blanket, carefully adjusting it at the edges. A moment later, her face lit up with a satisfied smile, feeling warmth and care. The guy stood there silently for a few more minutes, watching the girl. Finally, snorting with slight irritation, he confidently went about his business. As always, Eliza woke up alone in her room. After tidying herself up, she confidently walked down the long corridor, ready for a new day. The girl yawned deeply and thought about how rude her husband was. He left the room again, not even bothering to say hello or say a word to her. Despite this, Milady did not allow herself to be upset. Today she had the entire room to herself. She was happily planning to devote the day to reading history books. On the table in the center of the room stood an elegant teapot. Next to it stood cups from which light steam of freshly brewed tea rose. Nearby lay an open book. Taking one of the textbooks, Eliza settled herself by the window, where soft light fell on the pages. With obvious pleasure, she delved into reading, enjoying the silence and the aroma of tea. Catching the strange sounds, the girl looked up and noticed the maid. She seemed very tiny, and standing on her tiptoes, she looked so fragile that she could lose her balance at any moment. The girl's name was Anna, and her height was not at all suitable for such work. Suddenly, the little maid of honor staggered. Miraculously keeping her balance, she continued cleaning. Eliza remembered how a few days ago the maid had cleaned and washed the floor in the bedroom. She was shocked that no one had come to the girl's aid then. From the moment Anna arrived at this place, the senior employees began to overwhelm her with work. They shamelessly took advantage of the fact that she was still a child. Milady could not imagine how children could be offended. She gathered her courage and closed the book. Eliza stood up, determined that she would not leave this injustice unpunished. The maid Anna, having finished dusting, carefully climbed down from her chair and put on her shoes. Her face clearly showed stubbornness, as if cleaning itself was a matter of principle for her. The girl knelt down and began to rinse the rag. Suddenly, Eliza approached her, curiously asking why she was cleaning there. Noticing the bewilderment and confusion, Milady repeated her question. She emphasized that the duties of such a young lady-in-waiting were limited to cleaning the bedroom exclusively. Anna suddenly panicked. She began to justify herself, saying that she simply wanted to clean this room today. Eliza Rublina noticed that she was watching the maid change the bed linen and dust. She just nodded silently, trying to remain extremely polite. The girl asked Anna, slightly confused, why she had taken on this task. She explained that changing the linen was Lena's responsibility, and that dusting was Julia's job. With fear in her voice, the maid of honor admitted that a few days ago the women had asked her to replace them for one day. She had failed, and for this they had been severely reprimanded by Monsieur Marquis. Eliza frowned. Her gaze grew colder and her lips pressed tightly together. She was clearly considering what she had heard, and her eyes showed displeasure. The girl continued to explain, her voice shaking, that she felt guilty and decided she had to help the women. Her expressive eyes began to shine with tears. Anna, wiping away her tears, fearfully assumed that tomorrow the senior maids might also be reprimanded for her work. Surprise was reflected on Milady's face, and inside she mentally called those women hypocrites. Eliza realized that the ladies-in-waiting had made the girl do the work of three. When they were reprimanded for a poor job, Anna was given the same task again. Then the girl suggested that the women might have lied about being severely scolded. Taking the little maid by the hand, she allowed her to take the day off from work and gently asked if she had had breakfast. Upon hearing the negative answer, Eliza immediately sat Anna down at the table. Smiling, she offered her to try the lemon cheesecake, to which Anna hesitantly eventually agreed. Straightening up, Milady smiled slyly. Her gaze became excited, and in her eyes one could read the determination to deal with those two careless maids. The Duke sat in his study, bent thoughtfully over several letters. The dim candlelight illuminated his concentrated face, and his fingers slowly turned the pages of paper. Suddenly there was a knock at the door, and the man immediately straightened up. His gaze became tense and his features changed slightly. Then he gave permission for the visitor to enter. Eliza entered the room, bowing immediately. Albert Rublin looked at her questioningly, asking if something had happened. She only shook her head, assuring that nothing special. Raising her head, the girl said softly that she had come to ask the Duke for a favor. He nodded, giving her his full attention. Placing her palm on her chest, Eliza asked for her maids to be replaced immediately. The man frowned and asked in bewilderment what the reason for her request was. Milady stated that she needed maids who could keep the chambers in order. She added that they should also serve meals on time and change the bed linen. The girl noticed that at the moment she had only one lady-in-waiting. However, her only duty was to clean the bedroom. The Duke said that the employees should share their duties. Eliza explained plaintively that for some unknown reason only one of the three of them was working. Milady said that the young girl was so overloaded with work that she did not have time to do anything. Hearing this, the man frowned, thinking about the situation. Albert Rublin immediately ordered Aaron to sort out the problem. He bowed, indicating his readiness to get to work. The Duke folded his arms and stressed that they could not allow their young countess to be uncomfortable in this house. He promised the girl to sort out the situation and allowed her to leave. Eliza bowed and thanked him sincerely. The Duke would not offend her, because it was important to him that she remained satisfied. Milady was well aware that Albert Rublin was capable of expelling her from the house at any moment. However, this required a special case that could justify such a radical decision. The man was sincerely trying to create the appearance of caring for the girl, which did not escape her attention. Realizing this, she decided to take advantage of this situation while there was such an opportunity. As it became known later, that day the maids decided to spend time in the city square. For their absences, they were severely reprimanded and, eventually, fired from work. No one suspected that the women had already accumulated a lot of absenteeism. They worked half-heartedly, which led to the Duke's great displeasure. He was furious at such disrespect for the house. Dismissal without a letter of recommendation meant that the maids would not be able to work in aristocratic houses. Looking at their pleading looks, Eliza thought that they fully deserved it. After this, the girl began to show even greater initiative, constantly turning to Duke Albert. She did not miss a single opportunity to ask for his assistance in various matters. The man fulfilled almost all of Milady's requests, because she asked for very little. This time she wanted a book and an abacus. Eliza also asked the Duke to find her a financial literacy tutor. She had to try, because he clearly wasn't interested in her acquiring such knowledge. The girl turned to his lordship with an awkward voice and politely, modestly looking down, she explained that she wanted to study to become a worthy wife and please her husband Richard. In the end, Albert Rublin gave in, and Milady's plan worked. Smiling contentedly, she thought that she had shown herself to be a true actress, skillfully playing the role she needed. It was common knowledge that the Rublin family had a huge fortune. That is why the Duke did not limit Eliza's spending too much. The heroine understood perfectly well that this was worth taking advantage of. In this way, she could prepare as best as possible for the upcoming divorce from Richard. The girl was determined not to stop. She would try again and again until she opened her own successful business. Eliza was beaming as she walked into the office. The financial literacy lessons would definitely help her in the future. By the time of her divorce, she should be ready to provide for herself. Entering the room, Milady noticed her husband. Once she was close, she realized that he had been attending financial literacy classes for a long time. This was evident in his confidence and knowledge. Hearing the sound of the door opening, the guy turned around. Surprise and displeasure immediately appeared on his face. He asked sharply what the girl was doing here. With a snort of displeasure, Eliza reminded Richard that she was a countess. Her position required her to be financially savvy, and she was not about to shirk her duty. Sitting down at the table with her husband, the girl added that they would attend classes together. He folded his arms, grinned, and called the situation funny, clearly not expecting such a turn of events. The newlyweds' conversation was interrupted by a sharp cough. They both turned around instantly, and their gaze fell on the teacher standing in the aisle. The older man chuckled, happy to see the students. He had completely gray hair and a neat mustache. His small glasses and green uniform gave him the appearance of an experienced mentor. Approaching the teacher, Eliza politely introduced herself and said that from that day on she would be studying with him. He replied that the Duke had praised her desire for knowledge, and it was a great honor for him. Having written the topic on the board, the elderly man turned to the students. With a slight smile, he adjusted his glasses and suggested that the lesson begin. A couple of hours later, the teacher happily announced that they had learned the basics. At that time, Eliza was finishing her notes, trying not to miss a single important detail. Suddenly, the old man turned to Milady. He asked her to show him the numbers 326, 15, and 739 on the abacus. She looked up in surprise, but quickly understood and nodded. Eliza Rublina began to carry out the task with interest, mooing thoughtfully. Her husband involuntarily turned his head, watching how she concentrated on moving the abacus bones. Looking at the girl, Richard suddenly froze. Her concentration, slightly furrowed brows, and quiet whisper of numbers unexpectedly touched him. All this caused a warm, almost gentle smile. Suddenly, the boy reached out to the abacus, carefully adjusting the bones and explaining the mistakes. Eliza had put the number 15 correctly, but had made minor inaccuracies in the rest. Milady raised her eyebrows in surprise, froze, and then looked at her husband with curiosity. She clearly did not expect that he was not only watching her work, but also ready to help. Then the teacher turned around and looked closely at the student's work. Clapping his hands contentedly, he announced with a smile that Her Highness had completed the task without any mistakes. The boy looked at the girl questioningly, as if expecting gratitude for his help. His expressive eyebrows were raised in anticipation. Looking at her husband, Milady quietly whispered words of gratitude. Her turquoise eyes, like the ocean, sparkled in the light, reflecting the depth of her feelings. Eliza smiled awkwardly, clenching her raised hand into a fist as if trying to hide her embarrassment. She looked at the boy as if waiting for an explanation or some kind of reaction from him. Noticing Richard's uncomprehending look, the girl pointed to his hand. The brunette seethed with embarrassment, suddenly realizing that his hand was lying on the girl's hand. His calm face instantly flushed. The young Duke instantly pressed his hand to himself, turning away from his wife. His voice became indignant, and he sharply ordered her not to be distracted from her work, trying to hide his awkwardness. The boy began to convince himself that he was not helping Milady, but merely studying. However, beads of sweat appeared on his face as a sudden heat of embarrassment enveloped him. Looking at the girl again, Richard noticed that she was learning the material rather slowly. He thought that once she mastered the basics, she would be able to cope with more complex tasks. The young Duke took a deep breath, calming himself down. He began to think that perhaps Eliza could indeed be useful in financial matters in the future. The elderly teacher continued his lecture. He began to talk about the 5 basic tools for counting. The couple, listening attentively, concentrated on writing down important points. After half an hour of the lecture, the old man announced that the lesson was over for today. The students, grateful to the teacher, began to collect their things. My lady turned to Richard as he rose from his chair. He looked at her, puzzled, curious as to what she would say next. The girl said that she planned to go and see the property with Anna. Smiling broadly, she invited her husband to go with her. Richard looked at his wife skeptically, sighed deeply, and said he didn't have time for that. She frowned, deciding that he wasn't worried about her at all. A sudden childish voice addressed her ladyship. Eliza turned and saw Anna smiling. The girl bowed in greeting and then turned to the young Duke with polite respect. Milady sincerely thanked the maid for the blue cape she had delivered. Turning to her husband, she announced her departure, promising to bring cookies. The boy rolled his eyes sarcastically with a mocking grin. Then he noticed that the cookies were the kind of treat that children loved so much. What she heard caused a storm of indignation to flare up in the girl's soul. She indignantly spread her arms to the sides, realizing that Richard had called her a child, and a spoiled one at that. Previously, Eliza believed that they were going to get along, since they were both hostages to the situation. However, now she had strong doubts. Raising her voice, Milady declared that she was going to buy the cookies and eat them all right in front of him. Richard walked indifferently towards the exit, telling her to do as she wished. Frowning disdainfully, Eliza suggested that Anna set off. With shining eyes, the girl nodded confidently, determined to hit the road immediately. The young Duke was comfortably seated on the windowsill, stretched out in a relaxed pose. He held a small book in his hands, absorbed in reading. All this time the guy was haunted by obsessive thoughts. Looking out the window, he noticed that the sky was covered with clouds and it was about to rain. Richard knew that with the arrival of spring, the monsters in the forest were active. They came out of the thicket in search of prey. He shook off these thoughts and tried to focus on the book again. The young Duke knew that Eliza was more at risk from encounters with monsters than from bandits on the road. Although monsters were rarely seen close to the Rublin estate, a vague uneasiness did not leave him. Sighing heavily, the boy closed the book and stood up in frustration. He grabbed his coat from the chair, preparing to leave the room, feeling a growing sense of unease. Richard opened the window with confidence, knowing that if the monsters killed Eliza, the Duke would not spare him. There was only one thought in his head. He would have to answer for her safety. In the worst-case scenario, Albert Roblin could bring another girl to the young Duke. It was not worth excluding the possibility that she could be an evil and callous soul. In that case, Richard liked Eliza much more. Without hesitation, he let out a powerful stream of wind and immediately flew into the sky, striving for his wife. Meanwhile, Milady's carriage was heading home confidently, occasionally bouncing on the stones. Anna remarked that it would be good if the road to the northern gate was repaired as soon as possible. However, the road to the western gate also left much to be desired. The girl considered it bumpy and too long, which is why Milady suffered from every uneven jerk of the carriage. Eliza waved it off, assuring that she was fine. She added that she was glad at least that she did not have to walk. The maid continued that one could also get tired in a carriage from a long journey. Smiling, the girl repeated that she was fine. Upon arrival in the city, she offered to have tea with the cookies they had bought. Milady knew that in the Rublin family, men were strictly forbidden to eat sweets. Whether it was a treat from the estate kitchen or any other cookies, it was considered unacceptable. Just recently, the girl was thinking about her plans after the future divorce. One of the options was to open a large confectionery store. Fired up with the idea, Eliza approached the chef with a small request. However, she did not expect that they simply did not have the necessary ingredients for cooking. Milady consoled herself with the fact that she had managed to buy some ingredients herself. If that was not enough, she planned to go to town again on a fine day and buy more. Suddenly, the girls heard a wild roar, and then their carriage was attacked. They screamed in shock and panic, unable to understand what was happening. As soon as Anna felt a solid surface beneath her, she immediately rushed to her mistress. She anxiously asked if she was hurt, and Milady answered in the negative, trying to come to her senses. Suddenly, a scream of monsters attacking was heard from outside. These words immediately alarmed Eliza, and she panicked and tried to figure out what to do. One of the knights ran up to the carriage window, ordering her grace to lie down on the floor immediately. He added that the girls should not leave the carriage, assuring them that they would deal with the monsters. Milady's body began to tremble, and she pressed her hands to her chest in fear. She could not believe that monsters actually lived in this area. The girls met each other's eyes and took each other's hands. Laughing nervously, Eliza tried to assure both of them that there was no danger, since the knights had to deal with the threat. Cold sweat broke out on the young countess's face. She continued to soothe little Anna when suddenly her words were interrupted by the monster's attack. The carriage suddenly turned over, and the girls screamed in horror and began to grab onto everything in sight, trying to hold on. A neat box of cookies opened and the treats scattered all over the cabin. Eliza howled in pain as she tried to stand up, unable to comprehend what was happening around her. Everything was blurry and incomprehensible. Her mind couldn't catch up with what was happening. As soon as the girl heard the roar of the monster, her pupils instantly narrowed in fear. The blood in her veins froze, and struck by horror, she could not utter a word. The monster was huge, pinkish, with a gigantic mouth. Its body resembled a scorpion, with long pincers ready to pierce its victim. Anna's desperate cry brought Milady to her senses. She, still trembling with fear, hugged the frightened girl, trying to give her at least a little comfort. Eliza realized that the monster had knocked over the carriage and broken its windows. She could not understand what had happened to the knights and servants, and where they were now. The picture before her eyes was swimming, and the girl's thoughts were filled with terrible guesses. She was almost certain that all their companions had been brutally killed by this monster. The monster growled, trying to get its prey with its claws. Eliza hugged little Anna in despair, closing her eyes tightly in the hope of salvation. She did not want it to end this way. Suddenly, a powerful whistling wind came from outside, as if the storm itself had crashed down on the earth. The rush of air made the carriage tremble and the dust swirl in a furious whirlwind. A powerful gust of wind threw the monster back with force. It screamed in rage as its massive body fell to the ground. A confident male voice rang out, contemptuously calling the monster a dirty creature. Preparing to strike again, Richard asked how it dared to attack the Rublin family's carriage. However, this blow was not enough to crush the monster. It straightened up again, its powerful silhouette taking a fighting stance. Its gaze was burning, preparing to unleash its fury on the young duke. With a furious cry, the giant scorpion whipped its tail, spitting out a powerful stream of venom. But Richard, anticipating this attack, easily dodged, avoiding the mortal threat. Gritting his teeth, the young man raised his hand, calling upon the power of the heavens. Power bubbled in his palm, ready to fall upon the enemy. Putting all his strength into the blow, he hoarsely said that the monster would get what it wanted in full. The heavens opened up and a terrifying force crashed down on the giant scorpion. Millions of amps pierced its body, causing the monster to writhe in agony. The magic disappeared and the air smelled of burning. Smoke was coming off the monster's body. Its paws were twitching in convulsions. As the young man landed, he noted that one lightning strike was enough to finish off the monster. Having made sure that the danger had passed, Eliza began to call her husband for help. He turned around and saw that the girls were unable to get out of the collapsed carriage themselves. Having freed herself, the first thing Milady did was ask how Anna was feeling. She confidently declared that everything was fine, and the girl could not help but admire her courage. With a gentle smile, Eliza asked the girl to go and rest, since her help was not needed yet. She chuckled and sincerely thanked Her Highness. Richard, watching what was happening, was very surprised. His wife was taking care of the maid, forgetting about herself. He could not believe that she did not notice the wound on her hand, absorbed in caring for others. Seeing Richard, Milady gasped in delight. Leaving the little maid of honor, she quickly approached him, not hiding her joy at the meeting. With a beaming smile, Eliza thanked the boy from the bottom of her heart for saving her. Then, looking into his eyes, she promised to repay him with kindness. The young duke chuckled and asked with a grin what kind of kindness the cookie-loving little girl could possibly do to repay him. The girl, pursing her lips in irritation, asked if he was up to his old tricks again. Then Richard couldn't help but smile warmly. He knew he had done the right thing by rushing to help his wife. His decision had been right, and he was proud of it. Jewels sparkled in her braided blonde hair. They admired the girl and asked how she could be so sweet. They said she looked like a doll. The maid said that Mr. Richard should have fallen in love with such a beauty at first sight. Eliza looked at herself in the mirror and was surprised. She assumed that the maids must have put all their efforts into this outfit. But on such a day, it could not be otherwise. One maid assured that none of the children of nobles could compare in beauty with the young lady. Another agreed. In her opinion, the mistress looked like an angel descended from heaven. Another servant came to them. The girl bowed her head to the mistress in a polite bow. She told the lady that the master had already gone down. Eliza assured that everything had already finished and was ready to go down too. Soon our heroine, accompanied by her faithful maid, came down. She was delighted to see the young man, and immediately went to him, smiling sweetly. The brunette was sad, but noticing Eliza, he immediately perked up. The girl thought that he had always been handsome, but today he looked even better. The guy turned away abruptly, which surprised the young beauty. After all, he had just been looking at her, and now he was pretending that he didn't know her at all. She assumed that he was upset about something. The maid admitted that the young gentleman was simply excited by the bright image of Mrs. Eliza, but she did not agree. Coming closer, the sweet beauty greeted the Duke with a graceful curtsy. He only chuckled, assessing her. The man with the cane was gloomy. He said that as long as Eliza occupied a place in the Ruvelin family, she should act wisely, so as not to disgrace their family. He assured her that there were many candidates who could replace her. This seriously angered the girl, but she did not show it. Bowing her head, she gave the Duke a polite answer, that she was ready as soon as she came to his house. All set off at once, led by the Duke. The servants saw them off with their heads bowed low. The carriage had already been brought. The coachman and 2 pages were patiently waiting for the gentlemen to set off on their journey. On the evening of the monster attack, an invitation arrived from the imperial palace. The envelope with the coat of arms was on a silver tray. The emperor's intentions were obvious. Even though he had a crown on his head, his eyes sparkled with malice. She wanted to know if there really was a child who had taken the place that the princess was supposed to take. And wasn't it just a lie to avoid marrying the emperor's daughter? He also wanted to see if his target could be easily eliminated. Even if the family declined the invitation, the emperor would not take revenge. But ignoring the invitation would hurt Ruvelin's pride. So, as a result of this, 4 days later, our heroine and Richard were riding in a carriage with Prince Albert to the capital. They arrived at their destination only 15 days later. And Eliza didn't have time to rest properly after such a long journey. The tailors took measurements from the young beauty. The plans included a lush, luxurious dress with frills. The tailors around Richard himself were also busy. They all had to be properly prepared for the outing. Eliza was riding in the carriage, and she thought that she would not like to make such a forced march a second time. But then something caught her attention and made her wary. The girl wondered and looked up. Richard stared at her. The young beauty couldn't understand why he was staring like that. Eliza smiled slyly. She remembered the maid's recent words that she was unusually beautiful today. The girl asked artlessly why he looked at her as if something was stuck to her. Richard extended his hand, which caused confusion in his interlocutor, and then deftly removed the speck from her hair. It turned out that it really was stuck. They both came to the conclusion that it was a thread. Eliza, feeling awkward, decided to change the subject immediately. The girl asked Richard what he thought the crown prince and princess were like. The answer was laconic. Garbage, Eliza asked again. The young man looked menacing. He said that those two were a mountain of garbage that could not be recycled. This surprised our heroine quite a bit. Although she knew that he was always categorical in his assessment, today he clearly went too far. But their conversation was interrupted. A voice from outside the cabin informed the young duke and lady that they had already arrived at the imperial hunting ground. Therefore, they had to prepare to leave. A small foot in a white shoe with a soft pink bow stepped onto the carriage step. Richard gave her his hand to help her out of the carriage. The young man behaved like a true gentleman. Eliza looked around, a look of disappointment appearing on her face. A group of people were crowded in front of the tents. They were whispering and glaring angrily at the new arrivals. The lady who met them greeted the Duke. She said that she had not seen His Excellency for a long time. In one place, a multitude of noble people gathered. Ladies and gentlemen, young ladies and gentlemen. Soon a carriage with a red imperial pattern arrived. A couple with fiery red hair stepped out of it with the help of a servant. It was the Kairos imperial family. The expectant nobles bowed in greeting to the burning flame of Valencia. The young man waved his hand in greeting. He said he was glad to see everyone on this warm spring morning. The guests said it warmed their hearts to see that both their majesties were well. Asked Duke Ruvelin if this child was Ruvelin's next mistress. The man confirmed it with restraint. The young blonde bowed her head, greeting Alencia's mother. She introduced herself as Eliza Ruvelin. The lady brazenly and shamelessly voiced the thought that she imagined Lohengrin's child as a country bumpkin from the south. But in appearance the child looked like a capital noblewoman, and of course she considered this her omission. She asked Michaela to tell this child about life here with a kind heart. The girl obediently obeyed her mother. The full-fledged hunting festival was supposed to begin after the end of the official part, to which all those present were invited. The emperor's eldest son cheerfully called to all the children of the nobility who were at this event to follow him. One of the young men told his friends that last time he was sick and did not come, but today he was with everyone. The young prince assured that this time they would be able to see something interesting. The little blonde boy was shaking all over. His lips were pressed together and his gaze was fixed on one point. The longest table was already set. The dishes surprised with the sophistication of their presentation. 3 young men of their service were ready to work. Eliza walked along with Richard. She looked miserable. The hunting festival hadn't even started yet, and she was already feeling tired. But then her attention was drawn to a group of people huddled together and plotting something. The prince held the new boy. He told Ansel that he hadn't seen him for a long time, and asked why he had been gone for so long, and assured him that he had missed him very much. The little blonde boy was silent, looking down. His Highness said that he seemed to miss him too, and offered to sit him down opposite him. Our heroine couldn't understand what was happening here. Meanwhile, the prince was seating the guests at his own discretion, thus openly discrediting them. Eliza remembered the remark comment from their conversation in the carriage cabin on the way here. Now she understood what Richard meant, and His Majesty continued to seat, and he declared that the country bumpkin Lohengrin would sit next to Anson. But he changed his mind almost immediately, and he declared that it would be better to seat the future Duchess Ruveline there. The prince pointed his finger unceremoniously, and assured her that he was still not very familiar with her. But Eliza had already made up her mind. She decided to sit down in another place, in order to see what he could do to her in front of everyone. Our heroine could barely contain herself. She wanted so much to run up and hit the prince on the head. But for Ruvlin's sake she decided to behave sensibly, so she decided to wait a little. Sitting at the table, Eliza glanced to the side. She did not understand why Richard sat next to her. The eldest prince said that the young Duke Ruvelin's place was next to him, and he asked why he sat so far away. The young duke did not even turn his head. He was sitting at an impeccably laid table. Folding his arms across his chest, the young man answered reservedly that his wife was sitting here, and if so, his place was next to her. The red-haired prince's lips curved into a sly smile. His eyes sparkled with cunning. The graceful features of his well-groomed face revealed the idea of another intrigue. His Highness turned to Richard in an insulting tone, mockingly suggesting that the boy had become completely stupid. He accused the young man of behaving like an immature boy. The young duke did not react to his words. The prince allowed Richard, since such was his wish, to sit in the place he had chosen. All the others were ordered to sit as they had sat before. Ansel sat down carefully on the chair. His shoulders were tense. His fingers trembled slightly. The young man's whole appearance expressed inner uncertainty. It seemed as if he wanted to become invisible in this room. A sly smile played on the prince's lips. His closed eyes hid the sparkle of insidious thoughts. The red-haired man's pose expressed the imperiousness of a man accustomed to weaving intrigues. The table was laid with luxury. The prince announced that dinner could begin. But first, he paused meaningfully. All eyes, as if on command, turned to the far end of the table. Ansel shrank. With a broad smile that did not bode well, the prince asked whether it would not be better to give the first glass to his friend, who had come such a long way, before the ceremony. The servant tilted the bottle with a smooth motion. His fingers trembled slightly from the tension. The purple liquid flowed down the sides of the glass, filling it slowly, drop by drop. The light played on the edges of the bowl. The prince rose gracefully from his seat, his every movement radiating authority. He approached Ansel, casually playing with his glass in his graceful fingers as he asked his question. Eliza couldn't tear her eyes away from this picture. In the prince's thin, aristocratic fingers, The glass of grape juice seemed like a mockery. Something in his gestures made the girl tense up inside. The young Duchess's aquamarine eyes lit up as she took in the scene unfolding before her. Her mouth dropped open in disbelief. Grape juice cascaded over Ansel's blonde hair, staining it in jagged purple streaks. Cold drops trickled slowly down the boy's face. He cringed in humiliation and the attention. The prince apologized falsely and continued to pour the last drops on the unfortunate blonde's head. With a sly grin, the redhead said that he wanted to serve the first glass to his friend himself, but his hand trembled. The courtiers supported the prince's prank. Michaela claimed that purple hair suited Ansel much better. Continuing the humiliation, she asked if perhaps he should wash his hair with grape juice. Those present burst into laughter. They thought the prince's prank was funny. They flattered the princess. They noticed that the crown prince had a keen eye. Eliza did not share the general joy. She continued to frown at this disgrace. Wasn't simple intimidation enough for them? And the brother and sister were creating a similar atmosphere. The Duchess gently dabbed Ansel's face with her lace handkerchief. She tried to wipe away not only the traces of juice, but also the bitterness of humiliation from his pale cheeks. The girl's delicate fingers trembled. Eliza handed Ansel a handkerchief. With concern in her eyes, she quietly suggested that he wipe himself. It would be a little better. Her gesture was full of sympathy. It was a sharp contrast to the tense atmosphere around him. Anger distorted the prince's noble features. His voice boomed through the hall, trying to disguise the cruelty of his actions with feigned nonchalance. He insisted that everything was fine. The princess shot a dagger-like glance at Eliza. Her thin eyebrows drew together in indignation. Her eyes clearly disapproved of this uninvited interference. The prince's voice was laced with sarcasm. He noted the future duchess's kind heart. Every word was laced with venomous mockery, as if the very act of mercy was deserving of contempt. With casual grace, the prince reached for the tray on which stood another glass. His words about his intention to take care of his friend sounded only cold mockery, and the promise of new humiliations. The young man's slender fingers were once again clutching the fragile glass. He addressed Eliza with cold irony. He said that he must give one glass to the good young duchess as well. The vessel in his hand rose upward with menacing grace. Each movement oozed poisonous irony. The gesture was an unambiguous promise of further humiliations. Eliza's fingers dug into the folds of her dress. Her tense face showed barely suppressed indignation at what was happening. She looked defiantly at the prince. An unexpected gust of strong wind rushed into the hall, tearing the elegant hat from the princess's red locks. Her perfectly styled hair became disheveled, ruining her flawless image. The prince instinctively raised his hands, shielding himself from the gusts of wind. His confident posture vanished. A gust of wind ruffled his hair, and the glass in his hand swung dangerously. The entire hall began to move. The ladies grabbed their dresses and hairdos. The gentlemen tried to hold on to the flying napkins and all sorts of dishes. The prince's green eyes widened in surprise as soon as he saw what was happening in the hall. When the wind died down, all eyes turned to the prince. His impeccable attire was ruined by a large stain from spilled juice. The arrogance was replaced by confusion. A heavy silence hung in the hall. The red-haired princess jumped up from her seat. Her voice rang out in the ringing silence as she addressed her brother. Her face showed concern. Fury distorted the prince's face. His scream echoed through the hall, causing the guests to flinch. Drops of juice ran down his once immaculate uniform. His eyes burned with undisguised anger. The prince rushed towards the young duke. His hand holding the glass was shaking with anger. Every word was filled with rage as he blamed the dukes for what had happened. The guests watched the scene in horror. The footman held the enraged prince tightly. The princess begged her brother to calm down. Her voice trembled with emotion as she spoke of the need to change the ruined clothes. Reluctantly, the prince allowed his sister to lead him away. But his last words hung in the air like a threat. He promised that the duke would definitely answer for this. The princess quickly pulled her brother towards the exit. Eliza pursed her lips as she watched the scene. A simple thought was running through her head. Why was there any need to mumble something at the exit? The prince should have just quietly left. Milady froze, watching her husband slowly rise from the table. His movements showed restrained determination. An inscrutable expression froze on his face. Eliza said his name, but he only apologized briefly and headed for the exit. The young duchess was perplexed by her husband's behavior. Ansel stuttered as he tried to express his gratitude to Duchess Ruveline. He handed the girl a handkerchief dyed purple. The young man's simple gesture conveyed more than words could say. Eliza laughed heartily. Her laughter seemed to break the remaining tension in the air. With a slight wave of her hand, the girl showed that such a trifle was not worth gratitude. Milady rushed after her husband, her voice echoing through the hall as she called his name, her haste betraying her anxiety about what might happen next. The young duchess caught up with her husband already on the street. She thanked him for his help, but she heard from her husband that she was Ruveline, and that's why he helped. The girl looked at his back as he walked further and further down the path. Eliza laughed. Her voice sounded like a small ringing bell. Milady replied that she knew it, and yet she was grateful that he had helped her. The young duke stopped. Her sincerity caught him off guard. Something unspoken hung in the air. A light breeze fluttered the hem of his cloak. The young man's gaze slid over the girl's face. The thought that he was her husband made her think. The young duke's footsteps echoed along the cobbled path. The girl stood there confused. Simple gratitude had caused such a complex reaction. Eliza didn't understand what was happening to him. The blonde brushed away an uninvited tear. She watched his retreating figure. Maybe he didn't want to help. The young people went their separate ways. The silence between them seemed tangible, filled with unspoken words. A little later, Eliza looked with annoyance at the stubborn stains that had eaten into the delicate fabric of her dress. Every movement of the napkin only further smeared the purple stains. The Duchess complained that she had not been able to avoid being splashed with grape juice. The dress was beautiful, but nothing could be done. The maid nodded sympathetically, agreeing with Milady. Anna was angry. If it weren't for this situation, the lady would be having a good time with other girls now. Eliza actually used the grape juice as an excuse to leave, but it was a secret. The blonde gently asked her maid not to be upset. "You can have fun at tea at any time." The maid nodded in agreement. Suddenly a voice, barely audible but clear, made the young duchess freeze in place. She heard someone say that she needed to be more careful. Eliza froze motionless. She tried to understand where the voice came from. Anna turned to the lady, worried about her strange behavior. The two girls crouched behind the thick foliage. Eliza gestured for silence. They heard muffled words about simply doing as they were told. 3 dark figures stood in the clearing, their silhouettes clearly visible through the dense foliage. The lack of coats of arms on their clothing raised anxious questions in the girls about how strangers had managed to penetrate the hunting zone. The leader of the group pronounced each word clearly. His quiet voice sounded authoritative and confident as his companions listened attentively. He asked them to remember the following. Eliza pressed her palms to her lips. Her eyes widened in horror. The stranger's secret conversation suddenly took on a sinister meaning. The words that these men were after the young Duke Ruveline pierced the silence. The thought that Richard was in danger made the girl frantically look for a way out. The Imperial Knights could help if she ran and asked them about it. A terrible guess pierced the girl's consciousness. What if those suspicious people were sent by the Emperor? Eliza froze. She realized that each of her next steps could have fatal consequences. This could all be risky. Those who could protect Richard might already be involved in this dangerous game. Eliza remembered the Knights of Ruveline. They could be the only hope for saving her husband. Milady looked at the trembling Anna. The maid said that those people had left. She asked what they should do now. Eliza turned around. A plan had occurred to her. Milady ordered the maid to return, but the maid resisted. Stammering, she declared that she would go with her mistress. The young duchess's eyes gleamed with determination. Saving Richard became her only goal, and no danger could shake this confidence. 2 young men were standing by Duke Ruveline's carriage, chatting animatedly. Our heroine called out to Sir Tongon and Sir Arthur. They cautiously asked the young lady what had happened. Eliza reported that the young duke was now in danger, and their help was needed. She urged the knights to hurry into the forest to help the young duke. The boys laughed at her. After all, the imperial forest was guarded by the best knights of the empire, and they considered her words and worries in vain. But the young lady did not calm down, and she asked what would happen if her words were true, and their master really was in trouble. Then the duke would definitely not let them get away with something like that. Eliza understood that the knights had not sworn allegiance to her, and therefore there was no reason to follow her orders. With these words, the girl resolutely approached one of the horses. She intended to ride a noble steed. and she said that the boys had sworn a blood oath to risk their lives for the Ruvelin family, and therefore they had to keep the oath. Jumping onto her horse with ease, Eliza galloped away towards the forest. She herself thought that she had thoughtlessly sat down in the saddle and rushed into the forest, but she herself could not even imagine how she would find Richard in such a huge forest. The girl remembered that in the original, the young Duke was alive and had Hanes. But what if her reincarnation could create a new variable? That's why Eliza decided to find the young man as soon as possible and protect him with all her might. Then she felt the wind pick up. The gust was sharp and rough compared to the usual gust. So she realized that Richard was somewhere nearby. And obviously something had happened to the young man. Looking back, she saw not without joy that she was not alone. The Duke's knights were galloping after her. The girl pointed her finger in the direction and shouted that they should rush in that direction. Clinging to the horse's withers, Eliza mentally prayed for her lover to be okay. 3 Imperial knights stood near the vortex of the hurricane. They could do nothing against the elements with their swords, no matter how skilled warriors they were. Here our heroine saw Richard. The young man was calmness itself, and most importantly, safe and sound. He was in complete control of the situation. The young Duke Ruvelin was in the very center of the funnel. All the other participants were caught up in the wind and were spinning helplessly in the hurricane funnel. The damn monster controlled the wind. When it was all over, Richard sank to the ground exhausted. The knights' bloody swords fell next to him. Eliza deftly jumped off her horse and ran to her husband as fast as she could. He had emerged victorious, but he was still weak and could barely stand on his feet. The girl touched his clothes and asked with concern in her eyes where he was injured. The young man was shaking all over. And then his wife saw a trace of blood on his side. She assumed that his wound was deep and life-threatening. The wound on his stomach could cause a lot of trouble. Eliza hurried to help her husband and grabbed him by the arms. The young man was losing his last strength. Our heroine laid Richard down carefully on the grass. It was clear that his life was hanging by a thread. The hunt was cancelled immediately after this incident. The place where the young Duke Ruvelin was attacked was next to the hunting area. The Crown Prince and several other nobles witnessed the incident. For this reason, Duke Albert appeared before the nobles in the imperial hunting grounds and asked to be appointed as the main investigator of the failed assassination attempt. Of course, the emperor did not like this, but in order to avoid the distrust of the nobles, he handed over the right to lead the investigation to Duke Ruvelin. And when it was all over, Richard returned to the duchy and was able to receive the treatment he needed. Eliza consoled herself that the wound was not deep, but she understood that the imperial family was to blame. When the Duke was at the site of Richard's injury in the forest, the girl thought that he suspected something. After all, he just glanced at the state of the young man then. At some point, the maid Ian came up and stuttered and tried to address. Eliza was alarmed by the girl's appearance. She asked what had happened. She looked ill and her face was very pale. Trembling all over, the maid said that she had to say something. And she told that she had recently met a man in the corridor. It was the villain she had seen that day, and she decided to follow him unnoticed. The stranger entered the Duke's office where the conversation took place. Ian decided to eavesdrop. From what she heard, it could be concluded that His Excellency the Duke was the customer. The young lady was surprised and could not believe her ears. Eliza assumed he did it in the hunting area, and used Richard to demonstrate that the Ruvelin family still had power. And if you think about it, today people from other families constantly come to the Duke. Initially, the girl thought that those visits were connected with the desire to express condolences, but now she couldn't get her head around how her grandfather could do that to his grandson. Eliza was shaking with indignation. Having mastered her emotions, the lady turned to Ian and ordered that only she should know about this. The girl promised to be careful with her words. Eliza noticed that the maid was very tired and sent her to go and rest. The girl thanked the young lady. Soon the door closed behind her. Our heroine sat next to her husband's bed. She carefully touched his hand, and she thought that if Richard learned about the details of the latest events, he would certainly decide to leave the duchy, and in that case, she would be useless. But she couldn't pretend to know nothing just for her own comfort. And then Eliza decided to tell her husband the truth as soon as he woke up. Seeing that Richard had opened his eyes, the girl asked how he was feeling. He asked why his wife had not slept. She replied that her husband was sick, and she was taking care of him at that time. Looking gratefully into her eyes, the young man assured her that there was no need for that, and he sent Eliza to bed. She covered his hand with hers, and declared that she had something to tell him. And then she told him that the man who hurt him was his grandfather. Then she saw suspicious people in the valley, and then they attacked Richard. The young man said tiredly that he knew all this himself. The girl was indignant, but the husband reminded her that he was an illegitimate child from a commoner, and while his father was alive, he sent strangers to kill him more than once, because the boy was a disgrace to the Reuvenlin family. But after his father's death, the Duke came to make the boy his heir, and he said that if he had only half the blood of this family, then he could inherit the line. That was why Richard was here now, and he was going to end this hateful line with his own hands. The words she heard froze in the air. Eliza tried to comprehend their true meaning. Her aquamarine eyes widened and her fingers involuntarily squeezed the lace collar of her shirt. She was shocked. The young Duchess pursed her lips. The blonde thought that his character was like that because of his adolescence. The girl sympathized with her husband. How hard it had been for him all this time. Our heroine remembered the original. In the original, Eliza grabbed onto such a Richard by force. Therefore, he had no choice but to hate. The girl gently squeezed her husband's hand. She put all her support and devotion into this simple gesture. There was more in this silent touch than any words could express. Richard sat up abruptly on the silk sheets, his gaze expressing surprise and slight embarrassment at the unexpected closeness. His voice wavered as he asked what the girl was doing. Eliza stood before the Duke, not looking away, ready to protect him from any adversity. She repeated that she would be on his side. No matter what happened, she would definitely stand by his side. The young wife looked up at her husband and said a simple request. She smiled sincerely and hoped that the young Duke would take care of her. Richard paused. Then with a brief nod he confirmed his agreement. His gesture conveyed an understanding of the duty and obligations of his position. A slender man in an elegant dark blue doublet entered the room. A gold chain served as decoration. He bowed his head respectfully before the sovereign. His appearance was a response to the royal summons. The monarch departed from his usual ceremonies at this early hour. At his invitation, the Marquis of Feliz approached. The man paid his respects to his king. It was an honor for him to see his sovereign early in the morning. The king asked if the Marquis had seen it too. The man confirmed that he had. The king was talking about the hurricane Reuvenlin. He noted that the name suited this monster. The monarch admitted that the crown prince was very concerned about the security of the empire, and he asked the Marquis whether he should not, in that case, take the matter more seriously. The red-haired man asked Ramo what he would do if there was a possibility that the pawn could become a king in the future. The Marquis did not hesitate to state his position. He would have to destroy it. The king said that if there is no reason and it cannot be done by force, the guest, without losing his cold confidence, hinted that isn't it enough to just find a reason. The king saw his own face in the reflection of the tea surface, and the echo of the Marquis's words about searching for the cause filled the air with a cold premonition of coming changes. Every hint from the Marquis was like a dagger thrust. He skillfully directed the monarch's thoughts in the right direction. The man advised His Majesty to use the brotherly oath. Once upon a time, the 4 families that founded the empire took a brotherly oath. If the 3 families rebelled for a just cause, the imperial family would not be able to resist them. If the imperial family asked for help, the 3 families would protect it. The oath that bound the 4 families was like a double-edged sword. The same blade that could protect the throne could also overthrow it. Softly and ingratiatingly, the Marquis suggested that even if the king himself could not kill him, using this oath, he would be able to bring about his death. He considered using the oath to be the best way. In the silence of the room, Eliza fingered the abacus. 569 minus 192. The girl uncertainly decided that the answer was 367. The Duke watched his wife from the bed. He patiently told the girl the correct movement of the beads on the abacus. He asked her to move one more bead. The girl's eyes filled with tears and disappointment. Milady was very upset about the wrong answer. She hoped that this time it would be right. Richard reassured her. He noted the constant progress of the young Duchess in her studies. A maid entered the room, interrupting the occupation. She informed the young lady of the arrival of His Majesty the Earl of Arden and his son. Milady froze in confusion. She was perplexed about the reason for this visit. The maid continued her report. She mentioned the Count's gratitude for the great service that Milady had rendered. The Duchess was perplexed, trying to remember who Arden was. The name meant nothing to her. Richard reminded her of the recent dinner party and the grape juice incident. Ansel Arden. The realization that the young man was the Earl's son made the girl think. The maid suggested that the lady change her clothes. Eliza gladly accepted the offer. But her intention caused an immediate protest from the young Duke. He felt a desire to accompany the girl, despite his ill condition. The blonde carefully adjusted the blanket, covering her sick husband who so impulsively wanted to follow her. She reminded the young man that he was sick. "Where were you going?" The girl confidently left the room, leaving the confused Duke without the opportunity to object. Her light farewell gesture with her hand only emphasized her determination to meet the guest herself. A hint of annoyance crossed the Duke's mind. Not only was she leaving to meet a guest, but she was also getting ready to dress up. Her promise to be by his side now seemed empty. Shouldn't she be worried about him? Despite his illness, the Duke could not stay in bed. He changed his clothes and took up a position behind a column. He bitterly reasoned that since Ansel was so grateful, he could have simply sent a gift. The Duke watched from afar as Ansel and Eliza chatted casually. He saw their sincere laughter and lively conversation. The young man did not understand why they would break into someone else's house for the sake of some gratitude. His wife looked amazing. The beauty of the young Duchess caused him mixed feelings. He did not understand why his wife dressed so beautifully again. Ansel admitted that he was going to give the girl her handkerchief back, but the grape juice stain wouldn't come out, so he'd have to give her another one. Milady admitted that everything was fine. Ansel couldn't even imagine how many handkerchiefs she had. The guy suddenly hesitated and thanked the girl for what she had done then. The young Duchess replied that what she had done was perfectly normal, so there was no need to thank her. It was what those people had done that was wrong. And then she suggested that they speak to her informally. Ansel felt embarrassed. He began to stutter. Then he agreed. Milady thanked him. She said she would take the handkerchief, and hinted that she also liked expensive and shiny things. The guest did not understand. The blonde clarified that next time the young man could prepare as many gifts as his heart desired. The girl thought mentally that the more money she had for the divorce, the better. Suddenly, their casual conversation was interrupted mid-sentence. The young Duke's voice made both interlocutors freeze in amazement. The guy asked the reason for their merriment. Eliza greeted her husband's appearance with surprise. She reminded him that he needed rest. She asked why he was there. The young Duke explained his presence as a reluctance to show impoliteness to the guest. Ansel overcame his embarrassment. He expressed gratitude to Richard for helping him then. The young Duke asked with bewilderment the reason for this gratitude. Richard emphasized the naturalness of a husband helping his wife. That's why he didn't understand why the guest thanked him. Eliza looked at her husband in surprise, mentally reproached him for being too harsh. The blonde responded with a soft smile, insisting on his gratitude for saving her. Richard maintained a tense silence. Eliza mentally lamented her husband's inappropriate behavior, regretting his appearance. Suddenly, the young Duke staggered. His hand flew to his head. He complained of a headache. Eliza was worried about his well-being. That was why she insisted on rest. Milady apologized to the guest. Her husband was not yet fully recovered. She apologized that he came to them like this, and they had to leave first. It seemed to Ansel that the young Duke could have walked there himself. Suddenly, the blonde called out to the Duchess, causing her to stop in confusion. His hand slipped behind the lapel of his waistcoat. Eliza watched his actions with incomprehension. Ansel handed over an elegant envelope with an embossed coat of arms, decorated with a silk ribbon. The guest said that in a few days there would be a banquet at their mansion, and he would be glad if the Duchess came. Eliza was genuinely pleased with the invitation. She accepted the envelope with gratitude. Ansel expressed his hope of seeing her there. The young Duke at that moment was watching the scene with poorly concealed displeasure. Richard froze in a tense pose. His eyes narrowed. A meaningful silence hung in the air. At that moment, the atmosphere around the guy became almost tangibly heavy. The majestic castle towered in the darkness of the night. The stained glass windows reflected the dim light. Eliza anxiously reminded her husband to take his medication. Milady was carrying a tray of medicine. The girl suggested drinking it quickly. Richard sat on the bed and watched the blonde. The young man was clearly dissatisfied with the medicines. He believed that he would recover faster if he did not take them. Eliza, gently manipulating, asked that since he was a good husband, he should take them for her. Richard held the pills in his hand. He looked up from his medications and asked if it was true that the girl was going to the banquet. The blonde watched as her husband took his medications. She confirmed her decision to go. Eliza remembered today's dinner. The Duke seemed to want it too. After all, he praised her for helping Arden's son. The possessions of Count Arden actively traded with the Eastern continent. Friendly relations with them would be profitable. Although the girl did not like dividing people into profitable and unprofitable, but it seems better to use the chance and become friends with Ansel. For a carefree life after divorce, it would be good to have some connections. While Richard washed down the bitter pills, all these thoughts whirled through Eliza's head. She felt his intense, searching gaze on her, as if he was trying to read her thoughts. The young Duke held out his empty cup and suddenly asked her not to get close to him. Eliza asked him again what he meant. She went to the table. The girl started talking about how you can't hate your friends without a reason. Richard didn't understand her words. Then she asked if Ansel had done something wrong to him, or was it his fault that the crown prince had bullied him? The boy flared up. He asked why the girl had remembered the dog bone. The young Duke admitted that it was not because of that. He reminded the girl of her recent confession of fidelity, of her readiness to be on his side. His gesture betrayed his inner excitement. Eliza's huge aquamarine eyes shone with purity and innocence. Like a baby, she naively asked about his side. Richard was silent. He was unable to take his eyes off this touching picture. The young Duke suddenly broke off the conversation and announced bedtime. He jerked the blanket sharply. It flew up like a blue silk waterfall. Eliza froze in confusion, watching this movement. The guy covered his head with a blanket. It seemed like he was trying to hide from the whole world. The girl carefully lay down next to him and whispered goodnight. In response, only silence. The blonde fell asleep. Her light curls softly scattered on the pillow. The silence of the night enveloped the room like a blanket of stars. Richard gently touched the girl's tender cheek. At that moment, he thought about her promise to be on his side. These words did not give him peace. The young Duke quietly uttered his request to worry only about him, and he looked at his sleeping wife for a long time. He propped his head up with his hand, unable to take his eyes off her peaceful face. Eliza sat in the carriage next to her husband. The girl looked brilliant. The dress was decorated with the finest lace and elegant bows. Milady's light curls framed her face in soft waves. The young Duchess watched her husband furtively. She was surprised. She thought he wouldn't want to go, and he was dressed so beautifully. The snow-white waistcoat with gold patterns and monograms exceeded all her expectations. The young man was the first to get out of the carriage and headed towards the majestic staircase. The blonde assumed that maybe he jumped back like that yesterday because he was embarrassed. If you think about it, it's even cute. The young Duchess flinched as the young man's hand reached out to her. She froze in the carriage doorway. Her dress fluttered from the sudden movement. Richard stood at the steps, his hand extended in a graceful gesture. Eliza froze for a moment, looking at this unexpectedly gallant movement of her husband. The young Duke stood by the carriage. His dark hair set off his immaculate white suit. He looked up at Eliza. He spoke of an escort. The girl accepted the help with gratitude. It seemed to her that from that time on, her husband became a little more caring towards her. She felt a little awkward about it. The young couple looked very impressive. Eliza froze at every glance of her husband. She liked the reliability of the young Duke. The announcement of the arrival of the Rouvelin family was heard in the spacious hall, filled with the light of crystal chandeliers. Guests in luxurious outfits filled every corner, creating a living picture of silk and velvet. The host of the evening turned around. His snow-white curls swayed in time with his movements. Noticing the guests who had entered, he hurried to meet them. The dark turquoise waistcoat emphasized the slender figure of the Count of Arden. The man greeted them with genuine enthusiasm. He was flattered by the visit. Duke Rouvelin expressed his congratulations to the Count on his birthday. Conversations filled the room as the guests looked at the young couple. They called Eliza sweet. They said they were very well suited to each other. They were sure the Duke was calm as he looked at his grandson and daughter-in-law. The girl was delighted. She thanked everyone for their kind words. It seemed to her that the people here were different from those in the hunting zone. They were so good-natured. Milady noticed all these looks. They behaved this way because they could already see Richard's strength, and apparently they bowed. She did not like it, but everything went as the Duke had planned. The Count raised an elegant glass. He thanked them for making the place shine with their presence. With one smooth gesture, the host of the evening announced the beginning of the banquet. The musicians on stage created magic. The Count had prepared a lot. He expressed the hope that everyone would have a good time. Eliza's eyes shone with delight. So this is what a real banquet feels like. The maid announced that the young gentlemen were meeting in a separate room. Tea parties for the children of aristocrats were held separately from the adults. No matter what position you held, you were still a child. Eliza understood that this was done so that the children would not run in the middle of the banquet hall, thereby blackening and disgracing the family name. The girl stood next to her husband in the doorway. The massive doors were striking in their grandeur. The sunset sky painted everything around in golden tones. Eliza was pleased. This division suited her perfectly. The young couple entered the hall where the young aristocrats had gathered. Their appearance interrupted the story about His Highness the Crown Prince. All eyes turned to the newcomers. The atmosphere in the room was heavy. Tension like a thick fog began to envelop those gathered. Displeased expressions could be read on their faces. All these children followed Christian's orders. They did everything he asked. For them, the Crown Prince was a perfect being, so by obeying him, they rejected them. In the tense silence, Eliza tried to remain completely indifferent to what was happening. She closed her eyes and exhaled. She didn't care. Ansel came towards the girl. He greeted the young Duchess. He was sincerely glad to meet her. Eliza thanked him for the invitation. One of the young ladies watched them with obvious displeasure. The blonde noticed Eliza's husband next to her. He said that he was glad to see the young Duke too. The girl noticed that Ansel seemed to be very busy. The young man began to explain to Eliza the reason for his haste. He mentioned the need to greet all the guests. In response, the girl with a sweet smile let him go to fulfill his host duties. The young Duchess pointed to the table. It was full of delicious cookies. The husband showed displeasure at the excessive sweetness of the treats. He stood at a distance, folding his arms across his chest. The young man tried to avoid the treat. Citing his dislike of sweets, Eliza decisively interrupted his objections. She sent the cookie straight into his mouth. She noticed that her husband was too talkative today. With a sweet smile, the girl asked him if he liked the cookies she gave him. The husband remained silent. Milady interpreted his silence as consent. Suddenly the girl screamed. A tear rolled down from her aquamarine eyes. The pain from the chafed heel was causing discomfort. The elegant blue shoes with bows were not as comfortable as they seemed. Eliza should have refused and not worn the new shoes, even though it was her first banquet. But Annie and the maid said that they went well with the dress. So my lady had to agree. The girl resolutely moved away from the young Duke. She needed to rest a bit on the terrace. Richard clenched his fists. He wondered where his wife was going. Eliza was embarrassed by her husband's tactlessness. Her cheeks flushed. She reproachfully chided him for asking the girl inappropriate questions. The young Duchess found a secluded corner among the flowers. With a blissful smile, she leaned back on the sofa. A quiet sigh expressed absolute happiness and satisfaction. She enjoyed the moments of solitude. Eliza froze. She heard muffled voices from the corridor. Rose was asked why the Crown Prince had not come today. Through the glass doors, the young Duchess heard a conversation about the health of the Crown Prince. It turned out that he had fallen seriously ill a few days ago due to stress. She was surprised that Christian had fallen ill. He wasn't the type to die from something like that. Maybe he was just pretending. He was probably very ashamed. The shock of that incident was mentioned as the real reason for his illness. Eliza tensed as she witnessed the mention of Richard, the contempt that laced the speaker's words as they discussed his status as a mudblood. And they were surprised that he had protested. The whispers about her husband's past were full of poisonous details. There were rumors that his mother had been a prostitute, that he had originally lived on the streets, and belonged to a mercenary guild. Eliza caught her breath.